Hello everybody, my name's Annabel. This is the point where I make a clunky misuse of the sound system and people at the back start going, I can't hear you. Now the fact that you're not either means that I'm audible or that you're just only here for the snacks. No snacks? Fair enough. Welcome, George. We're here to commemorate the publication of your latest work, The Australian Moment. I think it's around about the 17th or 18th event for this book, which leads me to suspect that The Australian Moment is quite a long one.
It is. It's got an open ending, so we can keep talking about it.
That's the genius of your narrative, George. Listen, first of all, congratulations on the book. I mean, I think it's the best thing you've ever written, and it is this extraordinary work of history in that it's a living reenactment of the last 40-odd years. You start your story in about 1973. I assume that's because the year I was born, so this is mainly just about me.
There's an open letter to you. This is your country.
But, you know, your particular knack, I think, and I'm going to stop kind of blowing sunshine up your proverbial in a moment, but your genius is your ability to go back and kind of organise history. You use these funny little nuggets of popular culture and politics and economics to make sense of events that we all thought that we knew about. And, you know, I remember once, many, many years ago, because you and I first met when we worked together in the press gallery in Parliament House in the late 90s and then the early 2000s. I remember once having a conversation with you about what it was like to have an extraordinary memory, because I don't really. I mean, I have an okay memory, but you have this kind of bizarre, obsessive, boundless, out-of-control memory. And I remember you saying to me, and it's always stuck with me, that when you were a kid, you found it difficult to work out what things you should remember and what things you should forget, because automatically you remembered everything, and sometimes it got a little bit crowded there in your youthful brain.
Okay, there's a couple of things to bear in mind, and here's one of the things I've forgotten. There was a point in my glorious cricket career between the under-10s and the under-16s where I could record in the back of my brain every run I'd ever scored in sequence, which over a number of seasons gets a bit difficult, but mostly, you know,
not to mention weird.
Not getting beyond 18 for the first couple of seasons made it a bit easier, you know, the ones, the noughts, the fours and whatever. But at one point I just went nuts and got to 90 without stopping, and I couldn't obviously retain this sequence of those runs because I think I would have had to be admitted at that point. There were things like that. I could remember every football game I'd been to for about the first 5 or 6 years. Really weird little kiddie things, which I presume a lot of young men could do. And this being an AFL town, of course, you know, my multiplication tables I worked out pretty quickly. You know, a goal equals 6, so 6, 1 was 37, that sort of thing. Like, I actually blame the culture. It's got nothing to do with me, really. All I'm doing is taking on board what's presented to me as a kid. Now, one of the things, and this is, it took me forever to figure this out, if people didn't remember what I'd remembered, I had to remind myself that wasn't their fault. Like, if someone genuinely had forgotten the conversation that the two of us had all 10 or 20 years ago, in fact, I'm disturbed that you remember something going back to the late 90s, so maybe you're projecting some of my character flaw onto myself.
It's entirely possible.
It's possible. But yeah, no, one of the interesting thing was not holding it against someone if they didn't remember the conversation you were having with them 10 or 20 years ago. It's a weird thing, but it took me what, maybe half a lifetime to figure this out.
And now you're a completely normal guy.
Totally.
So tell me about the process.
I'll take it out
of how
on books, actually. It's a lot easier. It's good therapy. Well,
I mean, the results are pretty impressive. What you've done is kind of organise the nation's memory for us, which is, for which many thanks, incidentally. But how did you approach this task? Because as a reporter, I guess you kind of write about things that are happening now. You know, you get little scoops and that sort of thing. To go back and reconsider events that are literally old news is a completely different sort of discipline. So you started off, didn't you, with this crotchety group of former prime ministers, and then hovering over them all is this amazingly amusing and evocative Greek chorus of US cables that you've got your grubby hands on somehow. So tell us how you approached that.
Black and white, yeah, because they do inform the 70s. one thing, and I'll drop a name here, Laurie Oakes, when you first get to the press gallery, one of the first things he tells you if you do seek him out is read up on a period that you hadn't covered before, because if you turn up in Canberra, for example, as a political correspondent, in the first couple of weeks you think you know how the world works. You think that the world started when you got there. Now, I've got a particular theory about national memory. I think it takes a country roughly 20 years to start forgetting its previous mistakes, and then that's a point at which it starts to repeat them. If you think about the gap between, you know, the end of the Vietnam War and Iraq One, when this is Gulf War One, George Bush Senior. By the time you get to Bush Junior, who didn't serve in the army like his father did in the Second World War, you know, he would go to Iraq and Afghanistan. So that's one of the things that I had in the back of my mind, that I wanted to get a little bit beyond my reporting comfort zone, which is, even though I'd started in the press gallery in '88, I was quite aware of the story, you know, around the time of the end of the Fraser government and the beginning of the Whitlam government. Beginning of the Hawke government. So I've got a really good deregulation active memory because I've reported most of it. I thought, well, hang on a minute. At some point, there'll be a lot of readers who will take a lot of this stuff for granted, but probably like me, haven't dug down deep enough to the detail to be able to recall it with the same precision that I can recall, say, the 80s and the 90s and the noughties. So before this book began, I thought, well, I'd better start a decade before, just to remind myself, and also because you're looking at it with fresh eyes. This is my childhood, but looking at it now with adult's eyes. There were some patterns that started to repeat with the present day, like the oil shock to me became this living thing, not dissimilar to the GFC. I thought, hang on a minute. Okay, so Annabel's born in the same year as the oil shock. GFC's 2008. What was the big event for you in 2008? Did you have another kid?
I just can't even remember. No, I didn't.
Well, maybe you're planning another one. But I thought, well, hang on a minute. This is just outside my professional memory, and it's the beginning where the national memory ends. And I thought, well, this is probably not a bad thing to do, to actually start in this period that I am familiar with through AFL and Countdown and a few other things, and the bad hair and the awful stuff your parents bought you for your first job interview, all that sort of stuff. Like, I remember all that stuff, but I'm actually not that familiar beyond the headlines and the partisan memory of the Whitlam and the Fraser period. And once you look at the Whitlam and the Fraser period, you end up with, well, who wants to hear this story again from just a domestic perspective? And remember, the idea for this book is coming in the aftermath of the GFC, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, we'll now have a look at external shocks to be the frame for the book. So we don't begin with its time, we begin with the oil shock. So we don't then do, just a straight repetition of the Whitlam fiasco without, considering that the rest of the world was going mad at the same time, and trying to work out whether that was real or not, or whether we were just doing it on our own. So once I decided to dig beyond my immediate professional memory, this thing A came alive, but B, the present day made a little bit more sense to me, because I could start to track the change in our country over our lives. But I could also, the challenge was to be able to write with some authority on a period that I had absolutely no direct contact with. So it was difficult, for example, getting Gough Whitlam to agree to an interview. I'm not of his generation. He's sort of at the point now where he'll, talk to a Paul Kelly or talk to a Laurie Oakes or talk to a Mike Steckety, but he won't talk to, one of the deregulation kiddies, because we're a bit outside of his. Fraser, I've had relations with Fraser for a few years, so he was easy to get a handle on. Keating, obviously, both Keating and Howard informed the previous book. They dominated it in a funny way. We'll talk about the PMs in a sec. Hawke, I knew, but I hadn't really had a proper sit-down interview with him, because his time was sort of coming to an end when I got to Canberra. So, first point, once I decided to start at the 70s, I needed some active voices other than my own, because, otherwise I'd just be pontificating about a period. So the ex-PMs were all going to speak to that, but then how did I find it? I don't know how I found it, but then came this other thing, almost a fresh way to start telling the story of the loans affair and the dismissal, which was that the Americans were sitting there taking notes all the way through, and these diplomatic cables are priceless.
And everybody was leaking against everybody, like Hawke against Whitlam, Snedden against Doug Anthony, Rupert Murdoch against absolutely everybody.
Everyone. And each time one of these Australians came into contact with the Americans, they'd draw up a quick bio for internal use. So Hawke's biography began with his prodigious drinking at the time. He held the Guinness Book of Records for downing a pint in about 7 seconds or something, a world record which he just lost at some point in the last year or so before this memo was written. And of course he must have been explaining this to the Americans, because there is a note to file that says he has sacrificed speed for distance in this pursuit. So now it's not whoosh, it's 1, 2, 3, 50, 100, well before David Boone set that record, I think it was.
Were there all these US cables saying, Hawke dropped in, seemed a bit squiffy?
Well, I assume that they didn't think it was that unusual, because whilst they noted it, the thing they then focused on was this extraordinary ego. I'm going to be Prime Minister of Australia one day, Gough Whitlam, I can't stand him. A couple of memos later, Gough and I are friends again. It was just quite a passionate time. And,
you see, Wikipedia makes us think that it's only, Bill Shorten and Mark Arbib that did this sort of thing. But obviously it's a noble Labor tradition.
It is a noble Labor tradition.
Squealing to the Yanks.
Squealing to the Yanks, trying to impress them. But that's the other thing. If we bear in mind where we're in history, we're in the middle of quite a... Labor comes to power after 23 years in opposition. It turns out that the world is going mad just at the point that Gough comes to power. A lot of the history of this period kind of ignores the international setting, but it's okay, so I feed that in, point one. But point two, the Americans are in the middle of their own crisis. They're about to be humiliated finally in Vietnam. They're about to exit peace with honour or defeat with honour or whatever it is they're seeking. They've also got Watergate, and the media is in a state of flux, of course, because television is starting to become this big thing, and the satellite, beaming the world's insecurities in your living room, become another thing as well. So all this stuff, once you start to throw it in, gives you pretty good material to write with some confidence. I'm not a confident person generally, but to write with some confidence on a period that has been done to death by others.
So tell me what you did before we move on. Just tell me quickly how you approached these prime ministers. You gave them quite a, I think, deeply devious and very funny sort of a brief, didn't you?
Well, I had, for the previous book, I thought I'd hit on this brilliant idea to put Keating and Howard in the same book, because at that point a lot of people viewed him as polar opposites. So in a sense what I was doing with the previous book was telling the consensual story of economic reform between the two voices. But I enjoyed that process, but the difficulty I had facing a much broader sweep and also trying to make sense of the present day, because it's quite an unusual period in our lives. Like, we know that history's unfolding right before our eyes in our region. I thought, well, do I get them in again as legacy warriors, telling me how great they were and telling me how all the others were useless? The difficulty for an author, and having written a couple yourself, if you've surrendered part of your narrative to egos much bigger than yours, sooner or later the transcript service just starts to take over the writing. So I didn't want that, and in fact Ben Ball at Penguin would know that the first draft tried to exclude these voices altogether. I wanted to see if I could do a rough cut of the first of the 70s without any of the prime ministerial voices trying to haunt the thing. Maybe I got there, maybe I didn't, but it was in that first draft that I thought, no, the reason why I'm resisting having them in there is I'm resisting having them in there on old terms, on the terms in which they would want to participate in an interview like this. So I thought, well, no, let me try this a little differently. I'll tell them all that, I want to tell the story of your positive contribution to what I call the Australian moment. So we're going to be talking about the challenges that you faced in your time in office, but help me build an active voice model of what works in Australia today. And so you get to claim your bit, but, and here was the big but, you have to reflect on the positive contributions of predecessors and successors. So
you got them all to say something nice about each other.
And they went, Fraser said, I beg your pardon, which he did. Hawke just sort of went, can you repeat your question?
Please tell me that when you did the Hawke one, you were seated next to his jacuzzi.
No, he was actually... We weren't that far from a leisurely setting, though, because he did come dressed like he was about to go yachting that afternoon.
That's the guy.
Yeah, the big wide open shirt and what are those, marine shoes, those deck shoes, and very, very, very white yachting pants, I think I could describe that.
The bottom of the harbour trousers.
The bottom of the harbour trousers. Now, interestingly enough, the journo brain ticks in each of them, but especially in John Howard. John Howard understood exactly what the point was.
Yeah,
you know,
that's interesting.
You could be in, because he's also the most courteous of them as an interview subject. You can be in there if you play by this game, and it's probably not a bad. You know, they haven't been confronted this way before. Keating just did not want to play. I mean, Keating's
the funniest, because he basically he evolves his criticism to make it obliquely by means of being incredibly
he went
nuts.
hardcore. And for those of you who've seen the monthlies, I've run the full quote that I'd had to cut in half, because he just objected in the first instance. He had some nice things to say about Malcolm Fraser, which was one of the, you know,
just
between you and I,
just wanted to sort of.
Well, he didn't
have a go at John Howard, really.
He didn't primarily want to have a go at John Howard through his Malcolm Fraser praise, but he said, I'm going to praise Malcolm Fraser, and by contrast, I'm going to tell you why I don't like John Howard. I said, well, that's not the game here. And he said, no, I insist. And there was a very, very long quote, which I have published, but it just didn't get into the book, because it would have been a little unfair to all the others to let Keating then jump the criteria. But look, I think, and I'm still almost unpacking the experience in a way, because they started to align not on party or even personality type, but by leadership type.
So Keating, interesting.
Yeah, so Keating and a Fraser found common purpose, because Keating and Fraser, when they confront the Australian electorate, they, you know, patriots, but they see its flaws and are quite happy to tell the Australian people, look, you could be better. So Fraser's got his life wasn't meant to be easy. Keating's got his, you know, Banana Republic will all be ruined if you don't step up. And then obviously, you know, as his prime ministerial voice was the triple R of reconciliation, republic, and engagement with the Asian region. That's how you get to the third R. The region.
You just got to leave out the first word.
But so the two of them, it's a particular leadership model, which I think probably wouldn't be too bad today, because I think we're kind of looking for a leader that could tell us where to go next, rather than, you know, who's going to echo our latest complaint about the cost of living. But when you look at their history, the two of them had a very, very short shelf life with that particular brand of leadership. Now. Hawke and Howard, of course, who, you know, for their own reasons, buddied up, you know, so Hawke can you know, enlist in a way Howard through a positive comment about Hawke, and through a lesser positive comment about Fraser, you know, in the order of merit. Of course, you know, the two of them ended up aligning together. But think a bit behind that. The sort of leader that the two of them were always looking for the love from the Australian population, which Fraser and Keating never really did. I mean, they'll show you the opinion poll where their approval rating was up. Believe me, they all do that, and they still pore over these documents many years after the fact, just to show you how good they were in their prime. Now, I don't mean this disrespectfully. We just can never find jobs for them after power, and so a lot of it is tending to the legacy. But Hawke and Howard, and this would obviously go to a question about reform method. Hawke and Howard never wanted to tell the Australian people they weren't good enough, so there was always a bit of positive reinforcement. So they would seek permission more often than not for reforms, whereas a Keating and a Fraser would say, no, bugger it, we've got to do it.
Look, moving to the content in the book, I'm going to kind of kick off, although this is a bit unorthodox, on the last page.
You're not going to give away the ending, are you, for those who haven't read it?
It's a sting in the tail. The lady gets it. No. I want to read you something that is really the second to last paragraph of the book. You write, "The present day only feels uncertain because both sides of politics have been coasting intellectually for at least 10 years. The social reforms of the 1970s..." I'm just going to read the whole last bit, sorry. Okay. "The social reforms of the 1970s and the economic reforms of the 1980s and 90s were sufficient to get us through the GFC, but without a new generation of leadership that can tap Australia's willingness to continue to change, the great escape will be a comment on a successful past, not the confirmation of Australian greatness." That kind of struck me, because I think uncertainty is kind of the meme of our place in Australian politics, isn't it, at the moment? I mean, and for me, it was the unsatisfying spine of the 2010 election campaign, that no one could really have any certainty about either side, mainly because they seemed to be putting on the ideological apparel of their opponents. It's a deeply unconvincing device from each side. I mean, can you believe a Labor party that campaigns on the coalition's immigration policy, and can you believe a coalition that campaigns on Labor's IR policy? I mean, it just seemed quite odd. And I wonder if you could give us your views on where this intellectual failure has come from over the last decade.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting question, because I know both sides of politics have been internally asking this question of themselves as well. Suddenly it became difficult to do anything with the Australian public. There came a point, and it's probably around the implementation of the GST. By the time the GST was bedded down, I think the Australian people were over change, and I think they were looking forward to enjoying maybe the spoils of some of those big reforms of the 80s and the 90s. We talk about the social ones in a sec. I'll put them to one side. So the big deregulation project of the 80s and the 90s, which took, old certainties, threw them out the door, and almost a new middle was created in its wake. But the old middle, which is essentially the blue-collar male that used to sit comfortably on the middle rung of the income ladder, couldn't find his way back to the centre. And having had that experience, the experience of the churn of the 80s and 90s, I think there was a point at which where the nation just sort of said, enough. Now, people were writing about the end of the reform era as long ago as the 1993 election, when Keating was able to campaign against Fightback. But we had a bit more. There was a bit more going on after 93. We had on Keating's side, we had labour market deregulation and competition policy. On Howard's side,
superannuation
and superannuation. On Howard's end, especially the first two terms, he did a bit more IR. He did a bit more privatisation. He did the GST, and in between, he took guns off his own constituents. So there's quite a lot happening all the way through the 90s, and I think at some point, and again, 2001 is roughly the period in which you would start to tell this story of the end of the reform era. So I think people are fatigued, but something else starts to happen in 2001. We start to dodge a lot of the chaos in the global economies. So we missed the Asian financial crisis, which was a regional crisis in 97, 98. Now, we know that our experience was not unique then, because the Americans obviously didn't get the Asian financial crisis either. But New Zealand did, by the way. We used to benchmark against the baby brother in the 80s. Now, New Zealand had a recession in 97, 98. We missed the tech wreck in 2001. OK, that's one the Yanks got. We didn't get that. A couple of other countries in Europe didn't get that either, Britain and Spain for e.g. New Zealand doesn't miss that. It gets that as well. So we're batting two for naught. But I think at that point we were starting to look forward to whatever comforts of capital gain and...
well, that's the beginning of the terms of trade boom as well, that moment in time, isn't it?
It's quite a weird point in time where the rest of the world is convulsing again. The American business cycle is starting to break off from us, which we thought would never happen. China is about to start knocking on our door and demanding our minerals at absurd prices. They're prepared to pay as long as we just dig for them. So I think at that point... And bearing in mind that generation of leaders, we're talking now about Howard and Beazley in particular, and Crean and Costello, they've sort of come through the end of that reform fire of the 80s and 90s, and they're confronting an electorate that is ready to start counting up the winnings. So you can sort of understand why that generation lost the will for another round. So there was no room in those days for another Keating or a Fraser. We were looking at a four-term Howard government, essentially populist government. Of course, the other thing you've got to bear in mind, people forget this easily, we went to war in Iraq, so at some point, you went into a form of blank cheque governing to sort of do a bit of a bait and switch with the people about this other thing we were doing.
Aided by the fact there was just so much money sloshing about. I mean, how does that incredible boost to company tax receipts and so on change the way politicians and leaders operate, do you think?
Yeah, look, I think John Howard and I had a bit of a debate about this, and you're not going to indulge yourself by putting it in the text, but this is sort of forum where I can discuss it. He says, look, I know what your complaint is, and I know I was writing about this as long ago as 2005, 2006. This income surge to the budget, is it not actually, it's now past the point where it's actually the winnings from deregulation. It's now something else, and it's something you should be suspicious of. It's a little over the odds. Maybe it's the Greek in me, the son of migrants, that was thinking that there's something not quite right about it. I don't remember entering this particular lotto, but somebody's walked up and told me that I've won, as it turned out, something like $300 billion over the final term of the Howard government. So don't spend it all, put some of it away because something doesn't feel right. It turns out something definitely wasn't right because the world was about to blow 2 years later with the GFC. And he said, look, what could I have done? And he still says this to this day. What could I have done? How could I have sold a budget surplus of $50, $60, $70 billion to the electorate? Well, it turns out we went straight into deficit to the tune of $50 billion as soon as the GFC hit, from a notional surplus of $20 billion. So that from 20 to 50 tells you what the buffer should have been. It should have been 70, not 20. Of course, we'd be looking back at him as a slightly different leader if he'd had the sense to say, this reckless spending should stop. Kevin Rudd said it and helped him win an election.
Whilst handing out about $35 billion worth of
tax cuts. He underbid John Howard by roughly $1 billion a year. You know, but we're talking, you know, the difference between 35 and 33 over the forward estimates. It was a very, very small gesture. But obviously the polls were telling him that that's what the people wanted to hear. Yeah, look, I can understand how it happened, but you know, I don't think I was the only one that thought that there was something wrong at the time. It was just a very difficult thing when neither side of politics wants to take this sort of stuff up. I mean, who's going to listen to a hack at the Australian? I mean, it's... And a couple of bank economists were saying this, and then Peter Costello said, well, you know, I don't think I'd be inviting you to the next conference, the next closed shop, you know, explaining to you what's in the budget. I mean, it was very hard to push against this particular tide. And the electorate, of course, I wouldn't say they didn't know any better because their gut kicked in about 2006, 2007. The fact that they threw a government out that was giving them, you know, money they'd never seen before tells you that they did start to get a bit suspicious about the transaction as well. But yeah, we're talking about when this thing started. It certainly started at the beginning of the last decade, and then something weird came in, an exogenous variable, as an economist would describe. You know, China just comes out of nowhere and says, here's a whole lot of money. And so the political system's already a bit fatigued by the 80s and 90s reform, and then this money turns up. What are you going to do? Well, you will start to coast, I think, and that was that's the explanation for it. You can't forgive it, but you can understand possibly why it happened.
In the early 2000s, during the GST campaign that I really remember was this line that emerged about that no one would be worse off, right? Yeah. And that has reappeared, attached to nearly every significant reform since then. It seems you can't really attempt one now without issuing a blanket guarantee that no one will be worse off. Now, that makes for an extremely easy task for journalists because all you've got to do is run around and find someone who is.
And put them on the front page of your paper. Yeah, easy. Yeah. So,
I mean, is that a permanent thing now, do you think? And does that change the way political decision-making happens?
Yeah, look, I wonder, what we may have observed in the 80s and 90s was the exception to the rule. Because when I started looking back at the newspapers and the Hansard debates from the 70s, don't worry, I didn't read every page, but I did have a good look at it. All that beer cigs up stuff was around then. Full employment was assumed as part of the social contract. So even when inflation was heading towards 20%, there were all these cabinet debates in the 70s about making sure that no one lost their job. So this idea in Australia that, you know, everyone should be a winner, I think is partly due to the fact that we're looking after a continent with only 20-odd million people, and so that may be part of the sort of long-term memory that leads you to this particular point. But in the 80s and 90s, I don't remember, you know, with a notable exception of fight back, when if they claimed no one would be worse off and you found a loser, well, that was the story. I don't remember the test for a Hawke or a Keating reform program being show me that everyone's ahead, because basically they were trying to remake the economy. The assumption was that the country would go down the plug hole if we didn't do something about it. Now, of course, the last 10 years or so, because we're in the winning stage of 20 years of hard economic reform and another 10 and 20 years previously of social reform, it felt like you could ensure that there were no losers. But the problem with that is, and the economists in the room, there may be only two more in the room apart from myself, but the economists in the room know that if you coast for 10 years, at some point a country pays, and we're about to pay for it, one way or the other. This is why we're having these rather intense discussions in Canberra, which no one can actually translate for anyone, about productivity. This word sort of come back into the... here's a thought, actually. This is about 5 or 6 years into the Howard and Costello government, they stopped using the word productivity because that was like one of the phrases of the 80s and 90s. One of the reasons why they stopped using it, this is an interesting thing when the electorate ends up pulling rank on common sense, people thought it meant work harder and they thought they were working hard enough. Productivity equals working smarter as well as, for some people, working harder, but it's mostly about working smarter. But they were getting this noise in their focus groups that says, why they keep banging on about productivity? I'm working hard enough as it is. So we're moving into a two-income society at that point. So they just let it go. On the Labor side, of course, in those days, when they were in opposition, I thought they'll never get back to power. They were doing the thing which was the punchline of your first book on the Latham experiment, which was Labor felt at the end of the 2004 election that they couldn't get back into power unless there was a recession. So they had to try and talk the country down to convince people that John Howard didn't know what he was doing. So all that negativity, I think, from one side of politics, which was the then Labor Party, now is obviously the opposition in the guise of Tony Abbott. It was ever thus, unfortunately, for the last 10 years or so. The person without the power knew that at some point they could intimidate the person with it into promising that there'd be no losers. And of course, once they made that promise, you've never been better off and all that sort of stuff, they said, what are you talking about, where's mine?
I want to move you to, there's any number of chapters that we could pull out and talk about at length, but one that really fascinated me was your chapter on the cult of property. And as I read through, I read this line. First of all, the Australian fixation with bricks and mortar asserts itself at times of economic stress. Keating and his advisers weren't to know this because they had no experience of how quickly booms can get out of hand in a newly deregulated environment. The free market manual told them that an overheating economy could be cooled by allowing a floating dollar to rise in value, by keeping the budget in surplus, by restraining wages, and by increasing interest rates. Keating ticked all these boxes, but the economy would not easily yield. While the entrepreneurs began buying up office towers, Australians punted on housing. Prices surged, Poseidon-like, by 20% in 1987-88 and by almost 40% in 1988-89. That's an extraordinary recollection, isn't it?
Yeah, and just before the recession we had to have. And in fact, it's interesting. One thing I was too young to remember was that there was this huge terms of trade spike at about 73, 74, which was partly due to the oil shock and partly due to food prices. And my parents tell me this story. They got in at some point in property in the southeastern suburbs, and the person that we bought it off came banging on the door a couple of years later wanting it back because prices had trebled or doubled, and they hadn't bought. So they sold into a rising market but hadn't bought into a rising market, and the time they were ready to buy again, they actually, not that we're going to give them the place back, but this poor woman came around and started showing a friend of hers through her old place just to prove that she did have a 3-bedroom freestanding house once before her husband got rid of it. But what happened was, between about 73 and 75, there was this huge spike in prices, and in those days the Treasury did what it did. It just jacked up interest rates and it made that 74-5 recession worse. Now the 88, 89, 87 through 89 experience was supposed to be different because the deregulation manual, as you described, says, you can control these things, prices cannot get out of hand. But it turns out that what happened towards the end of the 80s was there was a big stock market crash in 87, and then in the blink of an eye, everybody took their money out of stocks and started gambling on property. A couple of other things happened which Keating had no idea how incendiary this thing was. He knocked off negative gearing earlier on and then reinstated it to try and save Barry Unsworth's government at the New South Wales election in 1988. Didn't save the government, but added a little bit of extra fuel to what was already a dangerously overheating economy. And of course, strangely, and I was digging through some of the numbers at the time, the same thing happened in the late 80s. Not forgotten. This is one thing I had forgotten. Same thing happened in the late 80s that happened again in 2001 and in 2008. When you get a surge in buyer activity, a whole lot of investors crowd out the first home buyer. The government reacts, sends a subsidy to the first home buyer. The first home buyers then do crazy things. They end up paying more than they would have if they just waited for the bubble to burst. And we've had now 3 episodes like this since the economy deregulated. So Keating's in the late 80s, and Howard had one around the time of the implementation of the GST, and Rudd had one in 2008 and 2009. Now, once history starts to repeat like that, you have to start to worry about what this thing does, what this thing can do to us.
But it's a policy cleft stick, isn't it? I mean, in the modern environment where political parties are extremely chary of creating identifiable pools of the disaffected.
Yeah.
You know, you go one way and you annoy people who are sitting on property assuming that there'll be these incredibly exponential increases in asset value, and then if you jump the other way, you annoy people who are amazed that they can't live anywhere near where they work and set up a house for themselves and their families as first-time buyers.
It's such a difficult thing to fix now because of basically what's happened to property values in the last, not just the last 10 years, but beginning with the late 80s. It took the economy roughly 7 or 8 years to reset from those prices in the late 80s. So basically you had flat or falling house prices all the way through to the second half of the 90s. And I could do the sums. I bought a place in Canberra at the end of middle of 89. My first repayment was on 17%. When I sold the place in 1999, when I got out, I barely got what I bought the thing for, and once you net it out for inflation, I was a loser, which, you know, is neither here nor there, but that's an example of what happened to a lot of people, I think, through the 90s, especially if they lost their jobs. I was lucky enough not to have lost my job. I was in a trade that enjoys misery. So in journalism, the fact that everybody else was losing a job just gave me more page one stories. So I was indispensable to the paper at the time that I worked for.
Yes, I do remember that period.
Yeah, but so the difficulty now, and this is the big question that is going to take another 10 years to answer, and people in the Treasury and the Reserve Bank wish that this discussion had been had 10 years ago. It's kind of like, it's never too late to have these discussions, but we should have had it 10 years ago, and that is, and we observe people are buying their houses later, so we also know that they're having kids later, so maybe the two are related. So housing, the decision to purchase a house may be delayed by other life choices. But what if the middle class can't buy in the suburbs it's working, in which their jobs are? What if the decision to delay the purchase of property, whilst you have this super cycle coming in over the top, means that home ownership is denied to the next generation? And this is a big, big question for public policy, but it's very difficult for the people in this room. If we're a snapshot of modern Australia, 1/3 of us own our home outright, 1/3 of us are paying it off, and the other third are renting. So those 2/3 are always going to outnumber the 1/3, the people renting or haven't bought into the market. So, and that's a really, really difficult question. But having seen this thing, and this is, I mean, as I say, I surprised myself when I was having a look at this, when I reread, and this is one of the reasons why I think a book like this needed, you know, a longer time frame. Even though I'd worked through this particular period, late 80s, and was a homeowner myself and could empathise with the battler, what I didn't realise until I could look back through 2 subsequent episodes, which is that 2001 and 2008 episode, is that in deregulation, a particular thing repeats, and this is part of our character. We do hug bricks and mortar at a time of economic stress, but what we're actually doing is inflating the price of this thing to the point at which it's not affordable for most people. So whilst, you know, big picture with the Yanks and the Brits and the Europeans and the Japanese is that they sort of got into property roughly at the same time. The Japanese did it about 10 years earlier, and then their prices collapsed and their economies haven't got going since. Our prices never collapse. This is the funny thing about Australia. What happens is you get 10 years of flat or falling prices, but you never get these 20% price collapses to correct for the 20 and the 40 that you had in those 2 years. So given that that is happening, and you can, if you think about the present day, why are people grumpy at the moment? They're trying to pay down debt. That's all they're trying to do. So you've got this almost never-ending problem. Well, the thing that makes us feel secure is also the thing that flips us out.
Listen, we're going to go to questions in a second, but I don't want to let this part of the discussion go without asking you about the role of the media in all of this. Now, you and I are the, I think, only 2 members of the Stop Weekly Opinion Polling Club. bit trickier for you because, of course, your paper is the.
Oh no, that's all. I think they tolerate my my little tilt at the windmill call news poll.
But I want to read out from you more broadly something about the role of the media. From towards the end of your book, you write, "The digital age recalls the insecurity of the stagflation decade when leaders lost their authority. Every institution in the 1970s failed: government, bureaucracy, the judiciary and the financial sector. Arguably only the media played a constructive role in debating the problems of the rich world. Today the media is an intrinsic part of the problem. The personal irony for me, as an employee of News Limited, the Australian arm of Rupert Murdoch's global media company, is that his British operation has been embroiled in one of the defining scandals of the era and closed the circle of Western cynicism that began with Watergate only almost 40 years earlier. The news of the world was like the so-called plumbers unit of the Nixon White House. The populist tabloid hacked the mobile phones of people in the public eye, often for the smallest of reasons, to gain column inches in the gossip pages." Now, in terms of the intersection of politics and media here, do you think that we are now in an irreparable death roll of shortening attention spans and shrinking audiences and desperate attempts by both politicians and media organisations to gather together enough ears to maintain influence?
Yeah, it's almost the biggest question for our profession. And if you define our profession more broadly as a political class, the people who talk about politics and the people who report it, which is them and us, but we're all pretty much in the same headspace. One of the things, and I made this point, although she did tell me I was a wimp, I did make this point to Julia Gillard, that I had a little more understanding for how difficult her job is, not as an individual, but just as for politicians more generally. We make them turn up every day, and this book tour, this never-ending book tour, has a sort of election campaign-y kind of feel to it. And 6 different capital cities over the first 3 weeks, and present company excluded. But every now and then there'd be a question that is a repetitious question, like a question I'd had before. None of the questions you've asked, by the way, have been asked before, so congratulations. But when you start getting into that little robot phase where you start to think, well, I've already said this before, but this is the first time they're hearing it, so I better say it again. Then you start to worry about how loose your wiring in your brain is, and you think, if I react instinctively to the next question, I'm going to say something stupid. So then you can almost hear yourself doing the political thing of dulling your language to make sure you don't make a mistake. So media appearance has become a form of survival art where I didn't inspire the nation, I didn't inspire the reader, I didn't inspire the listener, I just got out without making a mistake.
Because language in that circumstance, I quite agree, becomes this kind of protective carapace without which a politician cannot venture in public. And you get to the point, once it gets faster and faster and faster, as it has over the last 5 or 10 years, where a politician or a leader is using language as a protective device to conceal, not to reveal.
Yeah, and we do this thing because they're in our headspace, and they're, creatures of the media as well, and we can recognise a phony better than anyone. That's what we're paid to do. So we hear robotic language and go, aha, they're not speaking from the heart. I mean, we put them in that position, but then we go, aha, they're not speaking from the heart.
Because we say, come here, speak for 24 hours constantly, and the moment that you say something that sounds rehearsed, then I'm just going to go crazy.
Yeah, I'm going to go crazy. What are you doing to me? What am I doing here? There was an awful situation earlier this year which inspired the column Stop the Doors, Stop the Door Stops. Julia Gillard gets 4 crazy questions a couple of days after Christmas, so she's at Adelaide Oval. So she gets 4 crazy questions in a row. Why are you late? What's this about? It's already in the Advertiser this morning. And she's sort of looking at this reporter going, what are you doing? This is a good news story. We're about to, fund a car park at Adelaide Oval or something. There were a couple of other people there, and the reporter was annoyed that his time has been wasted.
I didn't know Alan Jones went to Adelaide for press conferences. Now, if you've got questions, do feel free to start moving towards the...
By the way, before we finish that, did I duck anything that you intended to ask?
Not at all. I mean, there are a million other things that I could ask you about.
Because having just talked about, what they do for a living, I don't want to end up having, because I forgot something.
George, it's fine. It's completely okay. Be at peace. But I will kind of throw to members of the audience audience, if you have questions you want to address, feel free to ask something about more recent contemporary events. Lord knows there's always enough fun at the fair to go around. So there's hands everywhere. Let's start with you, sir.
Thank you very much. It's been a most interesting conversation.
Thank you.
My question is, how much do you think the public is to blame? I mean, a lot of people believe that a large part of the Australian public is apathetic about our country's future. I know my parents are. They just don't give a damn about politics. And as a result, obviously the politicians need to maximise their self-interest by giving us what we want, but not necessarily what we need. So to what extent do you think public apathy, if it does exist, and if it is real, is to blame for our current predicament?
Yeah, I wonder whether the problem isn't the public's apathy, but the fact that both political parties over the last 10 years or so, they had these particular information gathering tools that, you know, look great when you're on the inside. You could basically find out what everyone's thinking at any point in time. And
you're talking about focus groups.
Focus groups especially. And if you find the electorate's disengaged, then you try not to upset them. But this is a decision the politician has made. The electorate didn't say, you know, treat me like rubbish. They're saying, I think what you do is rubbish, and I'm not going to listen to you until you have something interesting to say. But at that point, if a politician says, well, because I think this is what's happened to both sides over the last 10 years or so, there is a fear of the electorate which is almost unfathomable to the previous generation of reformers. You know, if the electorate had a problem, say, with, you know, reducing tariffs, which was the hardest thing that the Hawke-Keating government did, they went out and explained it. And they use the focus group as a tool to alert them to the dangers of the policy. If the reception in the electorate is a bit crackly, well, you've got to fine-tune it. Not necessarily through backflips and the like, but just through the repetition of your argument until they, you know, because they don't have to listen, do they? So there's a bit of that. But look, the other thing is, I wonder whether our apathy can be both a good and a bad thing. It keeps us earthed in a way, so we don't have these, you know, highly shrill camps like we have in the US, which is basically both sides seeking a form of ecstasy, one through God and the other through whatever liberalism the Democrats are looking for. And they're like 10 or 20% of the American population between them, but those two bases basically run the system, and it's total war there. It's a form of civil war anyway, but it is, compared to what we do, whereas our apathetic electorate tends to earth both sides of politics. But what's happened in the last few years, and especially in that 2010 election, I think we all wanted to go on strike at some point during that election. What they ended up doing was saying, what don't you want me to do? And they go, well, how long is this interview? They say, well, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do this, you don't want to do this. So they all had a repetition of negativity, both sides. And of course, at that point, the electorate said, hang on a minute, I don't remember this being part of the contract, so they hung the Parliament, which is why I think for those who were here the day after the election, when I finally got my head around why they hung the Parliament, I thought it was a thing to rejoice. I mean, they haven't enjoyed it since, but they won't give it a choice, so they said, well, I don't have to accept this, I don't have to accept this choice.
It was the most sophisticated possible piece of commentary on that campaign, though, really, that group decision to hang the Parliament, wasn't it? I just reckon all of this is a bit of a confidence game, I think, you know. All Australians are not deeply engaged in politics. They'd go mad if they were, and in a sense, I mean, political leadership is an outsourcing game, isn't it? You know, we want to make sure that there's somebody making decisions. I don't really want to be kept apprised of everything. I just want to get a basic sniff of where you're going and a sense of your bona fides. And more importantly, if you're going to make some decisions that are going to cause me pain, then I want you to be as courageous about it as you want me to be in the face of that discomfort, right?
Exactly.
So, you know, if you think of the hard things, you know, some of the hard things that have been done over the 40 years of reform that you describe in your book. Let's take some examples, you know, the deregulation of the economy and tariff reform and you know, maybe even the GST. They are reforms that were profoundly unpopular with a large section of the constituency, but the leaders who introduced them said, well, look, this could kill me, but it's important enough I think,
Exactly,
to do that, even if it kills me. Whereas I think in recent times, I mean, the best example, I guess, is the reversal on carbon pricing in the Rudd years. It was a kind of, I think this is the most important thing ever, but oh God, if you're not that into it, then we'll think of something else to do, which is.
And by the way, no one, and this goes back to the apathy of the electorate. No one asked the second question when Rudd was being advised, we've run out of time, we've got to go to election, you've got to ditch this thing, it's got to come out of the budget. It never occurred to anyone to ask the follow-up question, because they had the tools. They could have asked the focus groups, by the way, what would you think of Kevin Rudd having told you? So they never asked this question, by the way. What would you think of Kevin Rudd having told you this is the greatest moral and economic challenge of our time if he suddenly decided he was going to talk about hospital reform? And if they'd asked the follow-up question, they would have gone, don't do it.
Well, that's why they're called focus groups. They focus in on these teeny things, and you miss this giant issue, which is what do you think of leaders who say one thing and do another. We'll go for another question on this side, and then there's another one on that side, I think. And then you, sir, down the front.
Thanks, George. In reading your book, you make the point of the talent of the cabinet, particularly in the 80s, when Keating, Hawke, Willis, etc., etc. And now it seems like if any one of them was on the political stage, that would be the intellectual giant striding Canberra. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's... I probably... Because I recall the paragraph you're referring to, and what I probably should have done, it was at least hazard a guess. And because I have thought about it since. These are children of the Whitlam experiment. So they all got into politics around the same time, and they rallied around Gough, partly because of Vietnam, but partly because of, after those that came after Vietnam were sort of informed by things like, tertiary education, the younger ones anyway. So we've got free uni. There was the, women's lib. It started to kick in around that time. So it's actually quite an interesting period of churn in the society. And for whatever reason, it popped up a number of very interesting people who all wanted to be in public life at roughly the same time. So maybe it was the sense of possibility coming out of the 60s, and Vietnam kind of focused people's attention on, in those days, right and wrong. It would have been to that group. They all gravitated to the Labor Party, and the Labor Party became something a little more sophisticated than it was, in the 50s and in the 50s especially. So that may be one reason why they all clustered around the same time in the 80s. But the thing you've got to bear in mind is one of the reasons why they were so good was they'd had the lived experience of the debacle of Gough's administration, so they never wanted to repeat that mistake. So was it, did the times make them, or were they shaping their times? It's probably a bit of both. But you're right, you pull any one of them out, and if they walked into Parliament today, they'd be leader of their party, and they'd go straight to an election because they'll win it, especially if they could lock in the other guy as the opponent. And that is actually a pretty sad state of affairs, isn't it, if you think about it? Think about what just happened on Saturday. Campbell Newman comes from outside Parliament. Think of what happened in 2007 with Kevin Rudd appearing out of nowhere and operating above his party. Neither side of politics actually has the depth to be able to say our team reflects the following values and have the confidence to put them all out in debates and not just have leaders' debates in an election campaign. So we're actually, unfortunately, when, this is a related thought, but it might seem a bit random, but just bear with me on this. When they were trying to stop the Republic in '99, the forces for the monarchy or the forces for conservatism, they thought, well, we want to stop this thing because it might end up with a popular elected president, and you don't want Ray Martin to be a competing source of power, as it was in those days, or whoever it will be today, Shane Warne or someone. But unfortunately, we've ended up with a not dissimilar scenario, not a directly elected president, but a presidential style politics. We've hollowed out main parties, and both sides now get captured by these meteorites that sort of come out of nowhere. And if they can hold the public's attention for long enough to get into an election campaign, they've got power. And then they wake up. What do? They wake up the next morning and go, right, what do I do now?
Next question.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Annabel. This has been great. This is a good, you just provided a good segue talking about the Republic. I think the book is a really valuable and unique Australian history, and it's great the way you balance this polemic towards Australian identity with all the external shocks. But I was hoping to see more coverage of some of the Australian cultural moments that are leading to the Australian moment, and the Republic is such a big one there. How did you weigh up what to include and what not to include there?
Good question. There was there would have come a point where we would have gone from 400 odd pages. Sorry, I'm just looking at Ben Ball here in the front row. Gabrielle, you would have had another year before we could have hit send on it. It would have gone from 400 to 800 pages, and even if I'd been able to write, plainly and in an amusing way, I don't think you can.
He can't help himself, is what he's saying.
So I had to put boundaries around them. So the boundaries did become economic and look, the economics in a way. If you've read the book, the economics is a tool to interpret human behaviour. It's not about the economy. It's not about the inanimate objects. It's about the people and the decisions they make. So things like the Republic. Well, in a way, what the Republic did, and it was almost a footnote by the time I had a look at the bigger story, which is national resilience. The Republic, in a way, is a bit of a footnote. So rather than just covering it off, I think I would have fallen into a trap. I think once I started to cover off events to say, here's why I'm not going to include it, I would have then had to do pretty much and then this happened kind of book. I mean, the narrative is mixture of themes, but with the years as the anchors. But every single event would have had to have been recorded, and I had. I could think of half a dozen things that got left out, but the test was, did it inform the moment, why we were the last rich nation standing after the GFC, and how it was that we came from this sheltered, frightened nation in the 70s that thought it was all right, but every time it was tested it cracked up. How we went from that to this, whilst the rest of the world was repeating its mistakes of the 70s. The Republic, would have been only a small part of it. Better question going forward, sorry for a Julia Gillard-ism, is whether any of these things will ever come back. Now, there has to be probably a moment of, we're not in this headspace yet, of probably national confidence that we've got a resilience, but I don't think we've got a confidence just yet as a country to be able to start building something bigger. And architecture on things like head of state and whether you do or don't want a Bill of Rights or whatever, like that sort of stuff is really only for confident nation. I don't think we're quite in that headspace yet.
Unfortunately, we've got time for just one more question. It's you, sir, down in the front. I know there's many other questioners. I do encourage you to pester George in the book signing line later. I know he's up for it.
Thank you.
Sir.
George, look, I admire your work, and I think your integrity shows through in your work, but the newspaper that you work for, and indeed the company that you work for, arguably shows little integrity in its activity. I'm just interested in how you mentally square that circle.
Hey, can I do
You see, I could have said we're out of time.
No, that's all right, I'll take it. I'm happy to take it. See, I'm not buying for time because I actually do know the answer to this question, because I did get it asked. It got asked in Adelaide, not as respectfully, but it did get asked in Adelaide. And in fact, it was this very interesting comment on the Melbourne audience. People laugh, whereas in Adelaide there was a round of applause, like, and they were about to pick up the pitchforks and storm the stage if I'd cut. demand fresh water or something. I don't know what they would have been looking for. You're an Adelaide girl, you can tell me what's going on.
They're very parched.
But a politician would buy time and say that's a very interesting question and whatever. But the thing about the Australian, you got to consider the masthead and why someone like me would be working for it. We've got the best collection of writers in the country. No other masthead. I think our only viable competitor in the long run is the ABC, present company included. For whatever reason, Fairfax, and I don't want to run them down because I wish they were. Could be what they want to be as well. But they've handled the last 10 years a lot. Made some interesting commercial decisions in the last 10 years, and they don't have a collection of writers that would match ours. And I don't say, got some of my best friends are at Fairfax, But the Oz for me is still the best paper in the country, and especially that weekend paper. And whatever you think of this journo or that journo's, ideological predispositions, they're quite happy to have me on board. I'm not there as some sort of, there are people way to the left of me and people way to the right of me on the paper. But the fact is, you're never going to be surprised. You're always going to be surprised picking the thing up. Whether you've only got one or two favourite reporters, well, I'll put the question in reverse. Would you have the same thought about the Herald Sun? Leaving the back page to one side because we all read from the back in Melbourne. So that's pretty much it. And I haven't really had a chance. I haven't really, if you're wondering whether I've been worried about our editorial lines and stuff, half the editorial lines are actually informed by conversations that involve me. Like, we're going to hammer middle class welfare. Yeah, go really hard. Don't spare Howard, don't spare Costello, don't spare Abbott, don't spare Rudd, don't spare Gillard, don't spare Beazley. I mean, that's one of my babies. We're going to push for some sort of market-based rational solution to the water crisis. I've been informing some of those debates the last few years. I can't imagine any other paper in the country where I probably have as much to say, and that's obviously a personal decision, but I think it reflects well on the paper as well.
Righto, well that actually brings us to the point where we are more than out of time. Thank you, George. Look, congratulations on the book. It is an absolute cracker.
Thank you.
And I do encourage you all to go out and invest madly in all 400 pages of it and await the next episode. Thanks so much for coming this evening in such numbers, folks. Thanks again.